The way we talk about the disease, that is what propels our policy responses. So if we think of it as a foreign incursion, then we want to do things like close the borders or, control people's movements who are unwanted people's movements. And we want to create these weapons, vaccines and drugs. And, that might work for older diseases that we already had under control. But when you have a brand new disease like this one, and we're already seeing this, you cannot make a drug or vaccine fast enough to protect people from the first wave. And the first wave is the most deadly wave because that's when we have no immunity at all. And we're seeing the effect of that now. Instead of spending, we should have been spending way more time and resources prioritizing collective actions, which we're having so much difficulty doing now, sort of after the fact, after we've had these huge outbreaks, we have so much virus around. Now we're trying to talk about, well, maybe we should wear masks, maybe we should stay home, maybe we should close restaurants. We should have been doing that early on. And I think if we had told a different story about this pathogen, that it is a social phenomenon, that it is within our ability to arrest its spread by changing our behavior through cooperative actions together, I think we might have been in a...
And talk about how society has dealt with, for example, Zika and Ebola, and how COVID-19 is different from those pandemics.
Well, Zika and Ebola never really became full-on pandemics, of course, but as outbreaks, those are have been much more containable. But I think it's this, it's the same approach where we look for drugs and vaccines rather than looking at the deep root causes, which are, human driven. All of these things are coming out of wildlife and animals. All of these microbes live in animals and wildlife and are harmless in those environments. So we think of them as invading us, but what's really happening is we're invading their territory. So when we invade wildlife habitat, we destroy where the bats roost, and so they don't just go away, they come and live in our farms and backyards instead. And that facilitates all kinds of novel, intimate contact between wildlife and human bodies, whether it's wildlife trade or bushmeat hunting or wet markets or, casual contact, any number of those things. We are not getting at those root causes. And so since 1940, we've had hundreds of these new pathogens emerge, whether it's Ebola in West Africa, where it had never been seen before, Zika in the Americas, where it had never been seen before, or this new coronavirus. And so this is a drip, drip, drip of new pathogens that are emerging. And it's, the underlying reasons are because of the way we're interacting with the environment and with nature. These are things that are under our control. So we need to start talking about it that way rather than, casting ourselves as sort of the passive victims of these foreign invading germs.
People, in many cases, are learning the word zoonotic disease for the first time, the spillover, the jumping from animals to humans. If you could explain that further, just what you were talking about.
So about 60% of the new pathogens that we've been seeing since 1940 originate in the bodies of animals. About 70% of them originate in the bodies of wild animals. Those are not microbes that cause disease in those creatures. So just like we have lots of microbes that live in our bodies, they don't make us sick. We have, things in our guts and they don't make us sick. They actually are beneficial to us. So those microbes are living in animals' bodies. When we come into novel, intimate contact with those animals, say, for example, if a bat, there's bat excreta around and your kid is playing near a tree and gets a little bit of bat poo on their hands and puts their hand in their mouth, the microbes that live inside the bat's body then enter the human body. If that happens again and again, often enough, that microbe will start to adapt to the human body. And like every other living thing, when it finds a new territory to exploit, it starts to thrive. It starts to adapt and evolve to live, to colonize that new environment. And so that's how these new pathogens are being born. We are creating these bridges between the bodies of wild animals and our own bodies because we're destroying so much of the habitat where they live in. So instead of these animals living in far-off places where they don't encounter us very much, we are, cutting down the forests and paving over the wetlands where they would normally live. And instead, they're coming and living in our farms and gardens and backyards instead.
With the climate crisis contributing, to this.
Yes, well, because of the climate crisis, we also have wild animals moving in all different places, right? We have 80% of wild species are on the move right now, moving into the heights and towards the poles. And so they are encountering new human populations as they move into new places. And those movements, of course, are life-saving for them. But it just adds to these collisions between humans, microbes, and animals. And that is the process that brings us new diseases.